I just wanted, because we have some people from outside the university joining, I just wanted to begin with territorial acknowledgement. As this meeting is hybrid and we are not all gathered in the same space, I recognize that this land acknowledgement might not be for the territory that you are currently on. We ask that if this is the case, you take the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory you are on and the current treaty holders. As a member of the York University community, I recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaranto has been caretaken by the Anishinabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. So for our workshop today, we are very pleased to have our guest, Dr. Leora Gansworth. Dr. Leora Gansworth is a postdoctoral fellow at the Osgoode Hall Law School and a research associate at the Center for Indigenous Languages and Knowledges. She is an auntie, niece, daughter, relative, scholar, poet, and maker, a citizen of the Anishinabeg, who smoked my son's name at hockey this morning at Little NHL. Yeah, got some good luck there, and a descendant of multiple Indigenous lineages. Dr. Gansworth has contributed to projects of environmental justice, water governance, and related Indigenous research priorities for several years. She will be giving a lecture today titled Centered Research in Anishinaabe Ontology. Following the lecture, there will be time for questions and answers from both our online audience through the chat and for those in person. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Gansworth.
Hi, everybody. It's good to be here today, and I'll try to talk as loud as I can. Sometimes I go I tend to go really quiet. So if you can't hear me in the back, just let me know and I'll talk louder. So I prepared some comments today. When I was asked to come, I was asked to talk about my research process. So last year I finished my dissertation project, which seems it's all over the place. So hopefully I'll explain that better. And so I defended last year, and through that process, I developed a research practice that is founded in Anishinabe, Dasawan, our ways of knowing, and Anishinaabe-centric, which is a term that people frequently use to refer to our laws. So I studied a specific fish, a migratory fish by the name of Anguilla rostrata in the Latin classification system. And in the territory of my ancestors, that one was referred to as pimisi, which refers to American eels. So I want to be clear at the outset, I'm not talking about electric eels, I'm not talking about lampreys, I'm talking about a very specific fish, and I'll explain that in just a few moments. So I wanted to clarify a couple of the terms that I chose to use in the title of the talk. So why heart-centered, and why did I pick the word ontology of all the words that could be used? So the way I understand ontology, it kind of refers to broadly a way of being. And when I'm thinking about what it means to undertake research on the lands that have been part of my ancestral history, and on territories where the responsibility for those lands is assumed by others, I'm suggesting that ontology is a state of being that cannot be taken away. So if we're looking at a stream, for example, that is full of contaminants and has multiple dams running up and down it, that doesn't reflect on the spirit and quality of the water. So that's a connection that can't be taken away, no matter who claims that territory. The other thing I would say, and this is something that I learned a lot about, and I won't talk too much about it, but about the physical being of a heart, like a human heart. So as Anishinabeg, a lot of our understanding of who we are revolves around having a heart, the heart as the center of the being. And I would say too that one of the key takeaways that I want to mention is that the heart is a dark environment. So darkness is related to creation and possibility. And it's also an environment that is governed by electrical currents. So I don't know how much time we spend thinking about that, but we have a constant pulse that's beating through us at all times. And I find that really interesting. So when I think and talk about being Anishinaabe and being in the heart space, it is related to that, but it's also related to our concept of family. So these are some of the points that I hope to make this evening. We'll see how well it goes. There's a number of things that I would like to say specifically about eels and their very interesting migratory journey. Some of the specific methods I used, interactions with our Anishinabe law and our expectations for personal conduct, our perception, ethics, and responsibilities as I undertook this research and how I applied that, and specific findings in terms of how my research was redirected and changed because of the pandemic and for other reasons. And then the teachings of eels themselves, what we can learn from studying their migratory path. Other ideas about research and representation, perhaps the limits of representation. And then if there's time, I'd like to kind of propose some ideas on a future that looks a little bit different. So one of the things that I wanted to share right away is this image that is in Ottawa. The artist is Nadia Meyer. And this is part of a larger installation at Pimisi Station, which is the light rail station that pays tribute to Algonquin, Anishinabeg, and other Indigenous peoples in that area. So the sculpture is fairly large, and you can see it from the train, and you can get pretty close to it, but it's actually in the water. It's standing in the water. And the message, I think, I won't speak for the artist, but the message that I take away from this is that the sculpture itself is pretty fragile, right? But it's also a representation that we need to pay attention to this relationship. We need to pay attention to the ways that the city and the city's infrastructures kind of influence and affect the lives of eels, who, by the way, for the Ottawa River watershed, the Ottawa River watershed is a really crucial site for the development of females. So I'll talk more about the development in a little bit, but females are what keeps the species going, because when they migrate out to the ocean, they lay eggs and then they create the next generation. And so the development that occurs in the Ottawa River watershed historically has been really important. The headwaters of the Ottawa have been important to that. So all the recent development affects not only the species that kind of travel in that area, but the whole species overall. And then when I talk about our Dodem and being Anishinaabe, so Ode is our word for heart, Dodem refers to family, and Dodemag refers to families, plural. So I think it's really important, and I take this as a matter of ethics, to be really transparent and clear as to what I know about my family histories. I don't know everything, but I've been studying this for a number of years. So I do think it's really important to clarify who my families are, what our relationships to eels have been. And that's part of applying one of our principal laws, I would say, the Ban Disiwin, which is humility. And so through the years, I've developed, like, I wouldn't even say decent, I would say an understanding that these skills are really important. So listening to people, having patience, and listening respectfully. So I've studied a lot of archival materials and listened to a lot of people who come from a very different worldview than me. And so when we think about what it means to be a storyteller and what it means to be a listener, we're drawing on the skills of our ancestors. So I have this great quote from this text that's called Earth Elder Stories. Alex Wolff, who is Soto Ojibwe, he says, the use of the mind and memory were important. This is why the stories were told over and over again. The environment of that time held nothing to distract the listener and the storyteller. We are ceasing to be storytellers and listeners. And in doing so, we are losing that great virtue called patience, so strongly emphasized by the grandfathers. And I also wanted to make another point that I read. I read a lot of other people's dissertations because I'm like, what is so-and-so doing? It's interesting to me. And one of the points that I read in the dissertation of Dr. Alec Corbier, who's also an associate at the CIKL, he wrote that anyone professing to come from an Anishinaabe perspective has to address the intercession of the Manidug and the grandfathers and grandmothers. And so I think about that all the time. And I guess it was sort of by default that those those grandmothers and grandfathers entered my research process. And one thing I would say is, I don't want to like go too off track with this, but two things happened to kind of reorient the way I was thinking about how I was going to develop maps, because my discipline was geography and I was really interested in developing maps that showed where eels were doing well, where eels were not doing well. And so in about 2018 and 19, I started traveling to different sites and talking to people, doing that deep listening for that environmental history, ideas about environmental justice. And what I found continually was that there were these like small, but also not small redirections in the work. So for example, there was a time when I was in Mi'kma'ki, and there was a plan to meet with some people who were very involved with eel fishing and reading some of the sacred sites where eels live. And there was a major tragedy in the community, and everything in the research had to be kind of halted and redirected. And so for those of you who are embarking on research, you might know that like when you plan a trip, sometimes like that's it, right? You have to get what you can out of that trip. So that was the case for me, and parts of it could be rescheduled for sure. But that specific event, it was not possible to undertake those activities. So I went into a little bit of a panic and some disorientation, and I ended up ultimately going into kind of like an individual, like ceremonial meditative space where I was thinking like, okay, how can I kind of redirect myself? And I had a series of different sort of dreams and interventions where I was shown to kind of zoom out in the way I was looking. Like that one spot wasn't the only spot to think about and research eels. And then there was another time when I had another experience where I guess you could call it a dream, where I had visited way deep into the like bottom of the ocean, and I saw two of my ancestors there. And so it was really powerful and really interesting, because I always led the process with my tobacco and my petitions and asking to be guided in that way, so that I would be doing research that was ethical, that was responsible to the generations, and was contributing something new that we didn't understand yet about eels. So those views being like redirected were not things that I expected or set out to do, but they ended up becoming really instructive, because at times when I would see that I was traveling to certain sites and the plan wasn't going as planned, I would think about it from this other lens, right? And one of the key messages about being in the very deep of the ocean was that there's certain parts of the ocean that human beings just cannot and will not understand. And that is part of our limitation. Yet there are these other methods and other scientific enterprises that insist on trying to dig into those areas, right? And so that led me into thinking about eels in a different way. So along the journey too, I would say that it was a continual process of reciprocity, miigwewin, so receiving gifts and giving gifts, both to land and place, and also like in like a very interpersonal sense. In 2017, which was kind of the beginning of this journey, I lost my gram. And the picture here is a little piece of silver that I found. My grandpa passed in 2003, and he was a silversmith, and he used to make me the most amazing jewelry. And I was at my grandma's house, and I was in my grandpa's basement doing work or something, and I opened a drawer and I found this small silver part there. And it became a running joke with my mom and my aunts and uncles. They're like, oh, were you saying, did you forget to give that to me? Because that belongs to me. Because the heart was always my symbol in all my jewelry. I mean, the picture doesn't really translate too well, but there's a small turtle on there too. So I took those as messages that, even though I was experiencing like a lot of loss and a lot of uncertainty, that there was going to be guidance for this project and this process. So there's a number of places that I did end up visiting, and I didn't really translate them so neatly into maps. But there were a lot of helpers that came along the way. So Asema was always the first one, tobacco, Kishibekong, which is where I was born, Niagara Falls. That site was really important, which is interesting because eels historically don't tend to travel through there, but they're in the lake and river around. And then just some of the other places, and I mention these again because I think increasingly with Anishinabeg research methods, there's a lot to look at, right? So there's a lot of Anishinabeg thinkers who've come before and offered ways to think about how to engage in research in an ethical way and in a culturally informed way. And so I just would mention that there's a lot to say in terms of how these helpers showed up. But I'll just. And so again, too, I mentioned that ethical engagement is also looking to our ancestors, our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents. And so Anishinabe-centric, which is the great-grandparent, is a special relationship that I have with my grandmothers and grandfathers as well. So I included some of the ancestry here. It's really interesting because my father's a member of the Onondaga Nation. His mother was a member of the Onondaga Nation. She was Eel Clan. And so her mother was as well. And that's how the lineage is passed in that clan system. And then my mother's lineage comes from Algonquin Anishinabeg, as well as my grandfather, who was enrolled as Upper Cayuga at the Six Nations, but he was also enrolled with a tribe in South Dakota, the Anguillas. So there's a really interesting history there. And that history is connected to residential school, the Indian Act, and moving people around in these really big ways. And so, however, the interesting part too is that a lot of them coalesced around the Niagara River area. And there's a long history there within the Haudenosaunee peoples and specifically the Tuscarora Nation. So there's a lot to say there about that history. And I would say, like, just from talking to some of the people in my family and even in the surrounding community, we're at a funny time where there's still handfuls of people who really remember when there were a lot of eels around in the water, but those people are becoming less and less. And when my grandparents were around, I wasn't really following this journey too much. I wasn't really researching this. So that's kind of a little bit of a regret that I didn't really get to ask them that much. But I asked them what I could. And so just thinking, like, to zoom back out and talk a little bit more specifically about eels, this image kind of shows the different currents that exist in the Sargasso Sea. So sometimes this area is referred to as like the Bermuda Triangle. And on the image, you can see that there are four specific currents. Well, there's a little bit more than that, but they kind of move in a clockwise direction. And so it's like this gigantic swirling whirlpool that lives in the ocean, and that's where eels originate from. That's where the eggs come out of. And so, whoops, this slide is out of order, but that's okay. Okay, so this one kind of shows how that looks on a global scale. So there's multiple, like, huge areas of current in the ocean. And it's important to know that there are a total of 19 species of Anguilla eels all around the world, and they've all declined. So they've declined for different reasons, which I'll get to. And some of the current discourse that dominates them is related to trade, economics, and those kinds of questions. So a lot of the times when people talk about eels, the question of how they're valued is really kind of concentrated to economic terms, right? Are they valuable for a fishery? Are they valuable as a trade fish? With less attention given to what they contribute to the health of the water. And so something else that I think is really important to think about, and just in terms of their migration period, this graphic is not really great, but I'll try to explain it. It looked different on my screen. So like I mentioned, they start in the Sargasso Sea. They start as these tiny little eggs. They travel on the Gulf Stream, which goes up towards Greenland. And when they go there, they also kind of morph and change and grow into these little leaf-shaped, they're called leptocephali. And it looks sort of like a willow leaf, like a transparent willow leaf. And at that time, you can actually see their eyes and their gill, the spine is sort of like see-through, like it's transparent. And you can also see their heart. So you can see their eyes and their heart, and the rest of them is essentially see-through. I think that's pretty cool. And there's also a part of their physiology that has bioluminescence. So that means it glows under certain conditions. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. But as they grow, they come into all these different freshwaters and estuaries up and down the East Coast. And I talked to a number of people, and some of the archaeologists I talked to said there's archaeological evidence that suggests they would make it as far in as Duluth, Minnesota, and they would be found along the Mississippi. And that was really interesting to me because there's some areas like up by present day, the other Kittigan-Zibi Garden River. I talked to some people there and they're like, yeah, we don't have eels here. So it's kind of like, it's unclear like how and why they go to certain areas. And that's something that mystifies a lot of scientists too. Like they want to understand it. There's a couple of things that they know, like from their studies, they know and understand that eels are guided by a magnetic pull they have to the meridians of the earth. They also know that eels they have a really strong sense of smell. So they smell their way through the water. They're also guided by the moon. So they follow lunar cycles. And they also are individualistic, meaning they make a choice about where they're going to go. And some of them go like really far, and some of them don't ever even enter freshwater. It's really interesting. And as they grow and they get longer, they change color. So after the leptocephali stage, they go into a smaller, about maybe yay long, and they are kind of like a greenish color. And then they go a little bit longer, and then they're more of a yellow chartreuse type color. And then when they're fully grown, they're anywhere from like 4 to maybe 6 feet long. I would say in this day and age, 6 feet is a little bit on the high end of things, but 3 to 4 feet is pretty typical. And that is when they prepare for migration back out to the ocean. So when they go back out to the ocean, they have a really fascinating process there too. So when they're in the silver stage, they kind of, they hang out in brackish water for a while. And then in the fall time, generally speaking, sometimes other times, but often fall time, there's a huge mass migration that goes back out to the ocean, and they go into a fasting state. So they stop eating and they basically swim nonstop until their body wastes away into nothing. And then when they make it back out towards the Sargasso Sea, at a certain point, they just disappear. So to me, the way I read that and the way I hear that, it's like there's something about the ocean that they know how to navigate a part of it. Where they go, it's their path. They've been doing it for millions of years, according to some scientific studies. But again, for a lot of researchers, this is a really curious thing. And there's like an insistence on trying to figure out all the mechanics of that migration. So that was part of a little bit of my fieldwork study too, was finding out how different scientists thought about that. I'm just going to pause. Any questions so far? I just kind of flew through a lot. Okay, so we're good with the migration, right? So these are the life stages, and I'm going to go back here really quick, just to say too that like another way I thought about this in terms of thinking about it on a global scale is knowing that we have these 19 species. They all have kind of shared the same fate in some ways, like this mass decline. Their migratory path has been interrupted. And so when we think about our relationship with the earth, which is Kakamiga, that's kind of at the center of our human experience here, right? And as Anishinabeg, we understand that there are 4 directions, and in the 4 directions, we have Wawan, Jawan, Ngabino, Kiwinu. That tells us about the different ways that our seasons operate as well, right? So when the small eggs come in from the ocean, that tends to happen in the spring, and then the migration outward happens in the fall. So I think that's also really interesting. And the connection I'm making to the heart, again, to the human heart, is that the human heart also has 4 directions. And I think that's really interesting as well. So there's a lot more to say there, but I'm just going to leave that much kind of on the table to say that around the world, the 4 directions of the earth, there's a consistent problem with eels in that they're declining. And the way that I have developed my research practice as investigating and studying water, studying relationship with water, is about connecting kind of heart to heart with water. And Lawrence Gross is a member of White Earth who wrote a book about what it means to be Anishinaabe. I think it's called Anishinaabe Ways of Knowing and Being. So it's one person's take, right? And I think what he poses there is really fascinating because he says it's about heart to heart relationships. And so because of COVID and other things, I ended up having to really shrink my work down into very elemental things. And I developed a stronger relationship with water as a result in a heart to heart way. And so moving forward, just, again, why the decline? So there's like a standard list of reasons why people say eels have declined. Big one is fishing and trafficking, habitat alteration. So the draining of wetlands and the development of agricultural ditches is a huge one. Dams, the installation of dams, but also the failure to maintain dams. So there's a lot of old dams that exist in streams and creeks, and they're not even working anymore, but they're still interrupting fish migration. So that's interesting. And then pollutants. One thing I didn't put on this graphic was also parasites. So parasites are also a really big one. So the primary triad, so to speak, as of 2009 was said to be the damming of rivers, overfishing, and pollution. But now we're talking about a whole different set of threats with the changes to climate and to water. But interestingly, I've been reading some more, I'm always like trying to stay up to date with the literature on this. And some of the warming trends in some of the salt waters are actually helping eels along the increase in numbers, which is interesting. So there's a whole context of this debate over fishing. And I found this to be really interesting because, like, I mentioned the Ottawa River watershed, but also the St. Lawrence, and there's others to think about. Those were some of the largest eel fisheries kind of in the world, actually. And the St. Lawrence eel fishery has significantly declined. But there are some areas, including some areas in the States, like down in Delaware. And Delaware, for some reason, the eel population is doing really quite well. So there are some people who advocate from that lens that fisheries should not be halted because the population is doing fine there. So people there should be able to fish. But again, when you think about this huge scale of decline, in some areas, it's up to 99 to 100% decline. So does that mean that one area should be free to fish while the others are not? I don't have an answer for that, but I'm just saying there's a pretty intense debate in some sectors. And something that happened several years ago was there was a major tsunami that impacted the Japanese eel fishery. So again, Anguilla rostrata is the name of the eel I'm talking about that comes in from the Sargasso Sea into North America. It has kind of a twin sibling, Anguilla, which has the same path but goes toward Europe. So those two are intimately related. They kind of start in the same area. And for, again, some reason, some of them go this way and some of them go this way. But there are the other 17 species around the world. And sometimes people who want to build fish farms will try to get, capture eels off the coast of the United States and Canada and farm them in other areas. So there's a group out of, they're called the SPG, and they have been doing a lot of research on the trafficking and seizure of eels. And they refer to Anguilla eels as the most trafficked animal, and have made a suggestion that the global eel trade constitutes the largest wildlife crime on Earth because it often goes under the radar. So I forget which year it was. I want to say 2010, maybe. The European Union actually banned the sale of certain types of eels, and that made an impact. But I'm kind of getting off track. Just thinking about how this makes the most sense to Canada. So there's a couple different things happening in Canada, but also the United States. And the Marshall decision of 1999 was very squarely focused, excuse me, on eels. just gonna wrap up. This is what happens when you talk nonstop for 30 minutes. So the Marshall decision brought about a huge debate about whether or not Indigenous people should be able to fish for a moderate livelihood or for other reasons. And so I don't want to go too far into that because there's much more to talk about, but I'll just say that the fishing debate is quite vigorous in some areas, whether or not it's appropriate to fish eels. Habitat alteration is another big one. And so I made a comment here about salt marshes, because when we say habitat alteration, that could include any number of things, right? But what I chose to focus on in my dissertation was salt marshes, and why were salt marshes changed so greatly? Well, there's a couple different reasons. So highways, the development of highways, the development again of ditches and agricultural implements to make the land suitable for farming. And there's some really great researchers who were out of, I forget where they're out of. Travis Weisselt worked on some historical research that talked about the different ways that habitat alteration, including changing salt marshes, develops a sense of a naturalized environment for agriculture and related practices, which helps like very old pioneer stories, which they refer to as pioneer lies, to be developed into the consciousness of people. So to think culverts and other implements like that are natural, whereas the salt marsh is actually one of the greatest places where eels and other swimmers, I guess you could say, would be developing and would be growing and would be storing nutrients that they would then transport into other parts of the watershed. So when we think about habitat alteration, that has, you know, contemporary iterations of what's happening today, but it also goes all the way back into those early pioneer days when so many of the landscapes were altered to suit a settler colonial mentality. And so that's another big cause of decline. Another huge one is dams. And again, just mentioning, there's a huge and kind of undisputable body of evidence that proves that hydroelectric dams are by far the biggest cause of eel mortality. So one of the interesting things that came about was I talked with a scientist who explained to me the way that she understood eels' attraction to velocity. So they're attracted to whirlpools and different types of fast moving water, but it seems that they're unable to distinguish the difference between that occurring naturally and that occurring in a turbine for a hydroelectric dam. So they literally go right toward it and then get, you know, really shredded up. And, it's pretty violent. And one of the things that was hard for me to understand was how this can go on for all these decades, right? And people would tell me about it and they would say, well, it's not just that, it's that the dams also cause health to the rivers. So I found that there are people, non-Indigenous people, ecologists and others who were really, really, really interested in this topic because they wanted to know about Indigenous history, they wanted to know about relationships with eels, and they wanted to know about people's memories of what the rivers looked like before all these dams were installed. And so the idea of eel is kind of a byproduct of this modern system and a sacrificial species that we can just do away with is part of that discourse as well. And I think that's something that we need to rethink, right? And so this, the preceding picture and this picture are from the Chowdhury Falls site where there are some eel letters that have been installed. So eel letters are proposed as a way to kind of help eels get around the dam, but it doesn't solve the velocity part, right? The fact that they're interested in the velocity of the water. And I would say too, that some of the oral history that I looked at, again, was very limited by COVID, but I was able to talk to some people who described to me their experience of being with Anishinabeg elders in places like Algonquin Park and the elders describing how at one time they would be able to hear like fish migrating at night because they would be moving through the water at such a great velocity. And then as the years went on and the different buildings were constructed to support the presence of parks and interpretive sites and other things like that, that sound was not as audible and eventually was not audible at all. But at the same time, there have been recent memories and discussions of elders who can remember what the rivers would look like when eels were going through during migration times. And that specifically refers to the Silver Stage. And so petroglyph sites and other sites, material history and culture, we can find a lot of evidence that there was a lot of respect and recognition of eels in those. And quite literally written on the land in Mi'kmaq and also in Algonquin territory. So the skins were thought to be very helpful toward creating moccasins. They're waterproof, and they also help with acting like as a splint, like if you have a broken arm or a broken bone. The oil is medicinal, and the meat itself are very much, they're healthy, they're full of omega oils and also have other medicinal uses. They're used for technologies such as birch bark canoes, lining of footwear, doctoring and medicine making, and other important purposes. So a big thing that I would hear a lot too was that again, the older generation really considers eel to be a delicacy, and they feel so happy when people bring them eels because it brings up specific memories for them. So one of the questions I was asking in my work was, who's studying eels today? And I found a really interesting mix of people. And I mentioned earlier bioluminescence. So bioluminescence is something that is being studied in marine biology and elsewhere. And it's pretty fascinating because the incidence of bioluminescence is about a fish being able to protect itself, but also about being able to make itself visible to others in different ocean environments. And so the glowing innards of eels and other deep water fish are being analyzed for their potential use and benefit to human society. So they have a fluorescent protein, and one of the proteins that has been found in eels is called unagi, which in Japanese, unagi refers to eel. But this product is spelled UNAG, and it's the protein that has been sort of made into patented products that are proposed for use in human medical experiments. So they can be used for capital ventures, right? So biotechnological devices, scannable wearable technology, nanotechnologies, and other studies in microbiology. So I found that to be really interesting because some of the folks that are working in those fields are suggesting that eel conservation should be a priority along with other bioluminescent fishes. And I followed the research of these two scientists, biologists, Tsukamoto and Karaki. And so they recommended taking a really wide and broad holistic view of how to think about eels. So through three lenses: natural science, cultural science, and social science. So they each have sort of overlaps, and each considers different pieces. So evolution and ecology, morphology, physiology. And at the center of all of this is conservation, right? The idea that the species should be preserved and has an inherent value. But there's these other ways of thinking about it. And so they also included the idea of arts, tradition, and mythology. And that was where some of my work took me to sort of look at the different ways that Indigenous people in North America might be thinking about eels or have them as a priority to live with, right? So this is a little chart of some of the folks that participated in my study, which again was radically altered. It included originally like travel to Aotearoa and other places, and of course when COVID hit, all of that was not possible. But it was still really great. I talked to a lot of people, Indigenous knowledge stewards, archaeologists, fisheries people, geographers, conservation biology, sailors, and others, oceanography, scientists, anthropologists, etc. So that was unexpected, but it ended up being really great. And so I wanted to share a couple of the quotes that they shared with me, and this is a very small. There's a lot more, but this one was talking about how they never saw a live eel until they started their fishery degree study at their college. They poisoned a pond with rotenone to prepare it for stocking with bass and bluegills. A very large dark eel crawled out and made her way across the grass. We sort of shoved her off into a little drainage ditch so she could make her way to safety. I was amazed at her dogged determination to live, and I was impressed with her durability on land. There goes one tough fish, I thought. This was the interesting testimony too, because a lot of people talk about how eels can walk on outside of water on land, right? And so this eel had just been poisoned and started walking across some rocks and then, went back into the water, presumably to live. And so another person said that we have a lot to learn from eels. We have to understand how the species changed its population dynamics to survive. So this gets into that like morphological history. All anguillid eels are said to have an origin around Indonesia. And then with shifting of the tectonic plates, maybe they ended up in the Sargasso in other ways. I don't really I'm not sure about that, but that's just what the literature says. So the other piece that this person was saying was that we also have to think about their physiology, how they manage themselves in cold waters, they survive in frozen rivers, they go into a dormant state during the winter where they basically, their heart slows down so slow that they actually stop. And then they can sort of come back to life. That's really fascinating. So eels also contribute to carbon trapping, and their metamorphosis was said to be a really important thing to understand. And then some other people had been doing this research for a long time, and they were saying, here's what we need to do to improve the population in this particular area. So this was around the Ottawa River. And they said, we need to install eel letters and remove all dams. We have to conserve the natural landscape. We have to restore the riparian areas. We have to eliminate lawn chemicals. We have to change all of our land use policies, and we have to install green infrastructure for stormwater to make sure that the pollutants don't reach the eels. So a lot of that was, based on, again, years of experience. And they were seeing this as a way to integrate Indigenous ideas of healing with the land and undoing some of the really negative effects of some of this development history. That picture is sideways, which is interesting. I don't know why. But something I would say that I'm really taking away from this is that eels, by observing them and being in place with them, really tell us a lot about natural law. Like they're just minding their own business, trying to migrate through these areas, which they've migrated through for thousands, in some cases, millions of years. And because it's a dissertation, it has all these other framework elements, right? So I had to lay out my framework and explain how I understand colonialism. And James C. Scott is a guy who wrote a really great book, which I love. It's called Seeing Like a State. And it sort of talks about how the state mechanism simplifies everything, right? And authoritarian high modernism is a form of supreme self-confidence about continued linear progress, the development of scientific and technical knowledge, the expansion of production, rational design and social order, and the growing satisfaction of human needs and an increasing control over nature. So these are some of the factors which enable people to have a complete lack of awareness and knowledge about what happens to eels, but not only eels, to other swimmers as well. But the precursor to this photo too was that I was visiting a site with a conservation group and we were doing some sampling. And there was a woman that approached us, and I tell this story all the time. In some ways I want to tell myself, like, get over it, but it's so emblematic, so I'm just going to mention it. So she was like, what are you guys doing? This is private property. And we were like, yeah, well, the people who are in charge of the group said, we have permission from XYZ entity. We're allowed to be here to do this sampling. And so she asked us what species we were studying, and we said eels. And she just went on this mini like disgusted rant about how how she found them so nasty, they're slimy, get rid of them all, they don't matter. And it was, again, just an emblematic moment to show that people either don't understand them or don't care about them. And the interesting thing too is that the eels in this particular area have a symbiotic relationship with mussels, a particular mussel that lives and travels with them as they migrate. And those two together create really good outcomes for clean water. So together they work to clean the water. And that was really interesting to me because this area was heavily degraded. There was garbage everywhere. And this person was like, just saying that she hated eels for no other reason than how they looked. And there was a book, I forget what year it was, called Animals Nobody Loves, and eels were featured in there, which I find very offensive. So that's kind of what I'm learning, is that when we stop and we look backward at what's happened to our lands and territories, for me, again, I had to kind of trace my family tree, and I've always known my family tree, but I wanted to look at the different areas where eels were a prominent part of either the diet, ceremonial cycle, or other cycles of my ancestors. And I didn't intend to, but I ended up going to these places where I was very rooted and situated as it was. So that's why I say it's all part of sort of a heart-centered research. And I wanted to end with this quote from one of my participants who says, "Eels have tremendous ecological value. Each late winter to early spring, millions of glass eels enter the estuary. They can provide food for many different animals, even before the primary food webs of the river wake up from winter's slow period. Throughout their lives, eels wander throughout the food chain, both as prey for herons, eagles, minks, snakes, striped bass, and more, but as they mature also as top predators in small streams and brooks." So my takeaway message for all of you is that eels have value beyond economics, and we owe them a lot to help them with their migration. Be rich.
Do you want to have your Q&A now?
Sure.
And we already actually have a question from the chat.
Okay.
So our first question is, if eels can absorb CO2, what happens to the CO2 after it is consumed? Does the CO2 get transferred to other creatures who eat eels, like birds, turtles, raccoons, etc., and humans?
So wait, what was the question?
If the eels can absorb carbon dioxide, what happens to the carbon dioxide after it's consumed?
Oh, so they can support trapping carbon dioxide. So yeah, so that is, I mean, there's a couple different symbiotic ways of thinking about that. So again, when you're talking about, when I was talking about when they travel through and they release nutrients, that's one way. And so that I would say has a lot to do with their digestion, right? And the way that they expel nutrients. So when they're excreting waste and it goes into the watershed, that is the one form of excreting. But another is in helping the larger predators to grow, and then the larger predators have a relationship with the different plants that they eat. If that makes sense.
Thank you.
I have a few questions. The first one, like you ended with this point about it being on this list of unlovable creatures, and that was one of my interests. You gave lots of reasons why eels are amazing, but one of the things I was interested in, why did you choose eels as opposed to sturgeon or pike, or like what, if you could share just a little bit about that. And then kind of similar to that question, we have an undergraduate research methods course here in Indigenous studies, and I'm always fascinated in that process that leads someone or leads somebody from undergraduate studies to graduate school and completing a dissertation that requires such commitment and perseverance to get through several years of graduate study. So I saw those as connected.
Yeah.
But what was it that drew you to eels?
Yeah, I'm actually super glad you asked that, because in the beginning I was going to talk about, again, how it changed, because it wasn't always this. Like when I started at York, I wanted to do research in like up in Nunavut with some of the water security issues that were happening there. But again, I was led by my ceremonial process, my tobacco, just getting familiar with the different ideas of what's happening in the fields. And I found that the place where I could make the greatest contribution was by something that I was really directly connected to. So I started with water. And then when I started thinking about, oh, well, I really care about this situation that's happening with eels. And I mentioned eel is my father's totem. It's also the totem of a lot of my ancestors as well. And when I went into a ceremonial process with some Ojibwe people, that was the plan that they named me under as well. They're like, according to our traditions, you would be what your father is, which is eel. So I've always known that connection, like in my own sense of being anyway, because I always knew my dad was the eel clan. And then when I started to kind of research and realize that I had something to say about it, I followed it and it kind of grew from there. And something, I have like too much Western education. And I guess that's probably true of a lot of us, right? I got a bachelor's in English a long time ago, and then I ended up taking some time off, and then I ended up getting a degree later in environment and community when I lived in Seattle. And when I was studying there, I was focused on environmental justice, water quality improvement, and green infrastructure. So that was really interesting. And out there, they're really focused on salmon. And I just kept seeing the connection to eels. And I was like, that would be really interesting to think about that on the other coast and you know what that looks like. So I just began to follow it. And when I decided to ultimately do a dissertation, it was originally supposed to be in something about water governance. And I found that work was being done, like it was being taken care of. I didn't really see a gap in the field where I could contribute. So I thought, well, this is really interesting. Nobody's doing this, and it's something that I can sustain, because I think when you do graduate work, you have to have something you can sustain for a time. Otherwise, you'll get bored or disinterested or even discouraged. And then the other thing about eels being a target of dislike, like there's actually a really substantial amount of research for that. And some examples are coming out of, I'm going to say it's either Carleton or U of Ottawa. There's some studies that were done there with fishers and anglers along the Ottawa River. And the misconceptions about eels were pretty consistent with areas that I saw in other, with research that I saw in other areas. So for example, I visited down in the capital area of the States, and I talked to a biologist there, and he said that by and large, people would blame eels for eating up, you know, everything and taking away all the target species, and, you know, they're gross and nasty. People thought they were snakes. Again, people often think that all eels are electric and are gonna, you know, shock you. So there's just misconceptions, I think, about what they are and what they do. So I don't know if that answers.
I had a second question as well. You mentioned like conservation was at the center of the Venn diagram you showed. And then also there was the other part about how hydro dams are especially lethal, like perhaps the primary cause of destruction of habitat.
Yeah.
So I was wondering about how those two kind of meet, because so much of what we hear nowadays is like the future is green energy, and Canada, like Ontario, Quebec, this part of Canada is seen to be such a major contributor in terms of hydropower. And then that notion that actually that is entirely harmful. I'm just wondering, is there any research in terms of how those two might meet, where hydropower can be done in a way that's less lethal or ideally not lethal at all to eels?
I mean, a lot of people propose eel ladders as a solution, right? Like just help them get over with this small ladder. And I think by and large, the data on that shows that that's not the most effective way. But I do also think that, I mean, to me, the first step is creating awareness for people like, okay, there's this organism here, and eels are not alone in this, right? It's all migratory fish, but they're especially targeted this way. And it didn't really click with me like why until that biologist explained to me about their attraction to the velocity, right? Like they go right for it. So that was kind of a real eye opener for me. But in terms of development and more thoughtful development, I'm curious with you about that, right? Like what does that look like? And I think too that the ideas of conservation that are proposed by the scientists I mentioned, who are saying like, okay, we see conservation as preserving the species, but then for Indigenous people in Canada and in the United States, there's major fishing wars that have been in the name of what settlers call conservation, but it's really them just saying Indigenous people shouldn't be in public, let alone fishing, right? So it's kind of like, there's a little bit of balance there to think about what does it look like to create services that everybody needs, right? Like people really need and like electricity, for example, right? And that's often an argument that people make and say, well, you know, you use electricity, so, you know, who are you to talk about this conversation, right? But I think that innovation is the future. And what that looks like for eels involves, like it requires people who care about them and who care about an ecology that is not destructive. And those people are out there. And it's just, I think, really a matter of leveraging like the political piece with the development piece, the economic piece, and thinking about it holistically like that.
I find that's one of the challenges so often for Indigenous, if you want to call them solidarity or alliances, especially with the green movement.
Yeah.
Often it's like an expectation that it's just total preservation.
Yeah.
And then it gets a little bit more contentious if it's like for harvesting purposes.
Yeah.
Like what, you're gonna kill them and eat them too kind of reaction. And that would you kind of led us to that point of giving us that rhetorical question for the fishery, should they continue? And you mentioned like the Marshall decision, which of course was based on eel fishing.
Yeah.
And that ended up going to the Supreme Court and ended up establishing the right to a moderate livelihood. But I know like even within Anishinaabe communities that can be contentious too. Like I have family members who have food fisheries. And I remember seeing like a sturgeon harvest. And that's considered like in this part like a highly endangered species. And I remember people being very critical of that, but like to actually be in the boat as the sturgeon is harvested, it was actually quite moving. Like my one of my family, but instantly started speaking in the language to the fish, like to the sturgeon. Like there was, and that's where I think about like these cultural connections too. Sometimes it's almost like Indigenous people working in this field of conservation have to kind of be sensitive to these differences in terms of like sometimes you have these alliances. I don't want to say of convenience, but it's like you have a similar goal in terms of conservation and protection of species and habitat.
Yeah.
But the relationship is always going to be different.
Yeah.
I'd actually be interested in knowing what you think about continued eel fishery for Indigenous people.
Well, I can say this. I can say I've never been involved in any way in any type of eel fishery whatsoever. So I think that for me to speak on it is really just a matter of opinion. Like, it's like, I don't know. Like, I would say too that I was really surprised when I saw that in other places where there are some really stable eel populations, I was surprised to learn that that was even a thing, because so often it's like sometimes every so often you might see a news article or like a documentary or some like arts-based advocacy around like some artist or some other person, learned about eels, or they're a naturalist, right? And they started making advocacy and people started taking a moderate interest. And what they're saying essentially is that, this is a major crisis. The role of the eel has been under documented and we need to understand this better. And like, that's certainly true, but then when that's countered with like people who spend all their time fishing and they see eels constantly in their buckets, like, I mean, I guess I could see their point, but again, this question of like, why there, and why is that the case there, and why is it 100% decline in other areas? So what does it look like to have a so-called like responsible fishery, like according to values of Indigenous peoples? Like, I'd be really curious to know what that looks like too. And especially because when you harvest the eel at the glass stage, ultimately what happens is they go to a farm, and then sometimes they're like given hormones to make them become feminine and reproduce, lay eggs. Other times they're given hormones to make them bigger, so they can be larger and more meat. Mm-hmm. So I don't know about that. I don't have an answer. I'm sorry.
Yes, we have a few participants asking questions from the Zoom. One question here, how many kinds of eels are there? What family do the eels you studied belong to? Yeah.
So the specific population I was looking at is Anguilla rostrata, and they are one of 19 anguillid species. So there's Anguilla, Anguilla japonica, and a bunch of others. So the short answer is 19.
And one more question from the chat. Can you provide the Anishinaabe word for eel?
Yeah, so I've heard two. So from Ojibwe speakers, I've heard Anishinabe-centric, which refers to like a snake that lives in the water, but it's not a snake. And that was the exact translation that was given to me. And then for Algonquin Anishinabeg, which is where my maternal ancestry comes from, it's Pimisi, P-I-M-I-S-I, or P-I-M-I-Z-I, which refers, some people have said it refers to like the fatty flesh that they have, because their fish is really, the flesh is really fatty, and Pimisi and Bimidi are related words, kind of mean like fat or oil. Yeah, and there's others too, and I was some of the people I talked to described having different words for different types of eels in the different stages. So Manashkadosh was another word that was referred to, I think, between the yellow and silver stage. But unfortunately, that speaker who offered that word is no longer here. So I have a little legwork to do to find out the origin of that and what exactly that word means.
Would you say that studying the eel has helped you understand your roles or responsibilities as someone of the eel clan in a way that maybe not studying it so deeply would have influenced things there?
Definitely, like absolutely. I think one of our responsibilities as Anishinabeg is to understand our role in life, like and understand who we are and what our gifts are and what we can offer. And again, I think to that contributing to the community of peoples that I tend to be responsible to are often, like my ancestors, people who are not here anymore, but also like future generations. And one of the things that I see with eels is that although there is this tremendous devastation, there's also, to me, it's very hopeful, because it's kind of like we see the complete inversion of Mino Bimatsuin, our way of relating with life in a respectful and reciprocal way. We see that that's has such an imposition against it, right? So what does it look like, say 10, 20 years out, if we work on these relationships with each other, with land, with place, with our ancestors, with eels, with others, and what does that look like when we start to regain those relationships? And I think that it's a vastly different world that is completely within reach, but it requires a real focus, and that's where I was directed to kind of, continue the work. So I am continuing the work. I'm in conversation to sort of think about maybe, again, creating this map, right? Like maybe starting with a specific zone and then we can grow so that we can get a sense of where we might build these alliances with Indigenous communities who are interested. And I think there are a lot out there who I didn't get to connect with because of COVID and other things. I feel like I have a very small piece of the picture and there's a lot more to do.
That kind of leads, the other question I had was about your postdoc, like in terms of the research, is that kind of connected? And then I was also interested that it's hosted by Oscar, being a law school. So I was wondering if there's some kind of legal implications in terms of your current fellowship.
Yeah,
Can you tell us?
sure. Yeah, so as a postdoctoral person at Osgood, that came through the provost office, I believe, and that scholarship, or excuse me, that fellowship is 2 years. So I have some time to work on a couple different things. And one of the big pieces that I think is connected to what I talked about earlier is I received a lot of support and help from my community members and from my First Nation. So I have a really strong desire to sort of give back into those communities. And so I'm asking people who might have an interest in different legal avenues for environmental health, environmental justice, fisheries, not really fisheries in terms of like fishing, but different environmental relationships, like how my work can support them. So the first order of business, I started in December. And so the first order of business was kind of getting the lay of the land, figuring out the ethics protocol and all that sort of stuff. And now it's a research design to kind of look at the different ways that we can reinvigorate that knowledge sharing about eels and about the watershed, but also other priorities that people have in terms of, you know, how they could benefit from relationships within the law school and connected to it to ensure that their environmental health needs are at minimum being understood and addressed in some way. Because I think a lot of people don't realize the wealth of knowledge that comes from Algonquin Anishinabe peoples. They've been doing a lot of amazing work on the land for a very long time. And there's a lot that they have to say.
I have another question from the chat.
Sure.
I have a participant asking if you can speak briefly about following and applying Indigenous methodology within a Western institution and Western format in like a degree or a dissertation, and if you have any tips of dealing with the tensions that arise along the way.
Okay, what was the first part?
The first part is if you can speak briefly about applying Indigenous methodology within a Western institution and in a Western format.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that for me, this was to me, what ended up happening was kind of an invite for me to lean into like trusting myself and trusting the different ways that like my experiences were, some of them were for the dissertation and many of them were not, right? And so I had to think, okay, I could drag this out for like 7, 8 years. Sometimes people are in that zone where it takes a long time to write the dissertation. I didn't want to do that because I was having like health stuff and other things. And I was like, I need to be finished. Yet at the same time, I found that a lot of the things I wanted to say were not translating or not fitting into a really neat paradigm. Like for example, in geography, you have to do, there's like very specific things that you have to have. You have to have your methodology section, have your results section. I mean, it's all fairly standard. But because I took such a disarticulated way of doing things, I really had trouble putting things into those categories. And I ended up having to kind of make decisions where things were split into multiple things. Like I had 2 findings chapters. And, you know, I probably gave my committee such a headache. Sorry, Deb, and everybody else if you're watching. It was a lot of reading, right? It was like almost like a 400-page document. And then it became really clear to me that I had a lot. And part of that to me was also learning about the abundance that comes when we work with our ancestral lineage, because there's so much there, right? Like there's hundreds of years of lives that are available and connected to ours. And that was why I went through this way of saying that I was working with the heart intelligence, because that was also helping me to guide where I would make decisions and how I might look to different Anishinaabe thinkers who proposed really clear methods, right? Like Kathy Absalon writes really clearly about how to integrate Gindosuin, and other thinkers have said so much. John Burroughs says a lot. And then at the same time, I was also interfacing with other disciplines like geography, political ecology. So I was looking at those and seeing them as kind of like doorways into areas where Indigenous intervention into those disciplines actually provides a more broad picture. So for example, in some of the scholarship around animal studies, critical animal studies, I found that Indigenous people have a lot to contribute to that conversation, because sometimes critical animal studies can be very siloed and in fact can be, I don't want to say antagonistic, but incommensurate with Indigenous worldview. So I think having a really honest conversation in the literature was one strategy, but another was to really create my own practice. So I developed a creative practice of like writing nonfiction, poetry, beading, dancing, all this other stuff that I needed to do to like survive it. Not to make it sound like it's so terrible for those who are aspiring, but it is definitely like an alchemist's journey, I guess I would say, to create a dissertation, because you go in with a set of expectations and you come out with your results, which may or may not match those expectations.
All right, I have one more question. I'm just going to shorten it. It's how are eels important to health of water?
Okay, so I heard such great stories from people, again, prior generations, but also other places. So a very similar eel lives in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I had the opportunity to visit with some folks who were up here in Toronto in like 2019, and they were telling us about how eels, like that is what they understand eels. One of the primary benefits of eels is that wherever you can find eels in the water, that means the water's clean. So that means they eat a lot of stuff. They eat a lot of the like kind of floating material that's in the water. They sort of keep it clean that way. But also, again, the name of the specific mussel is like escaping me right now, even though I should know it. But there's a mussel that they travel with, and that mussel and the eel together have a sort of a filtration effect on water to filter sediments and other things out. And so I would say it's the shortest version might be just through consuming water, right? Or through consuming things in the water, but there's also other mechanisms as well. I hope that answers it.
I have a question for myself, actually.
Yeah, sure.
So you were talking about how eels are not a very life species. Did you ever have any experiences of talking with people or sharing stories about eels, and you were able to change their mind about how they thought about this?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think even just having conversations like this with people, like just like one-to-one or even small groups, like just letting them know like the historic importance, I think too. There's a whole part that I didn't even talk about here, and that was the time during like the fur trade and other eras of time where eels were so abundant that it was almost like guaranteed that you could always find something to eat with eels. Even in like really harsh winter seasons, you could find Indigenous people in Mi'kma'ki and in other areas where they would know exactly where and how to find eels, which I find so interesting because, again, some of their behavior in the winter, like they burrow in these like salt marshes and other mud areas, and they're like really deep in there. And yet Mi'kmaq and others know how to find them and how to spear them in a very like ethical, I would say, way. And that's been very interesting to me. And there's a couple different historians who wrote about New France and about how during that time of the development of New France and the so-called New World, eels were just, there were so many of them. And the eel appears a lot in the Jesuit relations as well. So when you start to learn and think about, you know, the radically different world that we have today, which is kind of hostile, I would say, to eel migration, and then you think about that prior world, it is really causes people to reflect and think, oh wow, like maybe this is a species I overlooked, right? And there is value. So I hope that that continues to grow.
Are eels generally like gentle animals? Have you ever had an experience where you've been like
Gentle
way or like are they vicious ever? Like do they bite?
I would say that from what I've experienced, I have not experienced them to be vicious per se. I haven't really heard of them biting, but a couple of my participants mentioned that like they might bite lightly, but at the same time, they're really strong. Like they're super strong. And in order to measure them, they have to be kind of sedated with clove oil, which is said to be like, you know, fairly benign and doesn't really harm them. But when conservationists are doing that, they have to actually sedate them because they will flip all over the place. And when people get them on, you know, on a line, that they also like flip all over the place. And again, they're really, really strong. So I don't know that they're like out to hurt people so much as they're trying to preserve their life. That's how I would say it.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
We want to say in English on behalf of the Senate. Oh my God. I just wanted to say to Lindsay, she did a lot of the communication in terms of making sure we were connected and everything with me. So thank you, English, so much. Yeah, wonderful. And also Dr. Natalie Lacostling, our research center coordinator, was also involved in organizing it. And our director, Sean Hillier, is probably out there right now watching online. And so just on behalf of the center and our class as well in English for coming, it was a wonderful talk. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, that's again.
Just before we sign off, I'll mention we also have an upcoming research seminar a week from now titled Navigating Water Systems, Change with the Ebb and Flow of Indigenous Knowledges. And that'll be by Rachel Arsenault. That'll be like virtual at noon a week from today, so Monday, March 20th. And we have more information on our website, and you can also register with the center online and get regular updates that way. So anyway, thanks to everyone for joining online and in person. And until next time.